Welcome to Catholic Economics. I'm your host, Levi Russell, and today is August 2nd, 2020. Today, I'm really excited to have my friend Francis here to talk about the historical origins of German economic policy. And that may not sound very interesting, but Francis has a very specific argument, or has a specific kind of interesting take on the way German economic policy works and how its relationship to sort of what a Catholic ideal would be. And so, obviously with this show, we're always trying to build ideas about economic policy around the social teaching of the church and not the other way around. And I think the other way around is where we get these ideas that, Marxism is a good idea, or, that Milton Friedman's ideas about capitalism are totally Catholic, bro, or whatever. So today, Francis is going to talk with us about this German economic policy. So what would you say, Francis, what is it about German economic policy today that you think kind of fits in line with Catholic social teaching? And obviously, it's not going to be perfect, but what do you think they're getting right?
Right. So I guess I'll start with my thesis, if you want to call it that, is that I think maybe not so much today, but back in, I guess you could say, maybe the Cold War era, post-war West Germany, the German economy was built in a way that I think is the best of both worlds, in a sense that it is the most pragmatic, at least today, in what we've seen so far. It's the most pragmatic application of Catholic and broadly Christian moral and social principles applied to political economy. So if I could sum it up, I would say that the German economy, the idea of the social market, is the most practical, pragmatic form of distributism, is what I would say, that we can look at as an example today. Specifically, I'd say its emphasis, the three major principles are on solidarity, subsidiarity, and corporatism, which are three principles we very much so believe in. I think you would agree that if we were given the reins of power and able to build an economic system, those are the three principles we'd primarily build it off of.
Yeah, I think maybe the corporatism one, some people might not agree with, but
right.
As I read more and more about, for instance, the Constitution of Dollfuss, Dollfuss is Austria.
Yeah.
I'm starting to understand this idea a little better, and I'm warming up to it in a sense. Yeah.
So I would say there's kind of two or three sides to the Catholic economics debate. You have the liberals in the classical sense, you have the anti-liberals in the sense of Dollfuss and Salazar, and then you have your Traditionalist left Caths, obviously. So you have your left Caths who are obviously the pariah, but I would say when it comes to, because we have to find a compromise point, right? In America, it's just not feasible that we're going to get like a Dollfuss constitution corporatist system or something like Salazar with the new state or anything like that. We have to work within the confines of kind of liberal capitalism. And I think when you look at German economic policy, it is the best form of liberal democratic capitalism that you're going to get.
If I can sum that up in the way an economist would state it, I would say that given the constraint that we're going to have to live under liberal capitalism, the optimal the optimal function, or the optimal set of parameters is this sort of German combination around the time of the Cold War.
Yeah, I would argue at least. I think if I can, I don't know if you want to go into specifics just yet. If you wanted to give, like a little background on how it came to be, I mean, however you want to take it.
Yeah. So, well, I think maybe what we could do is just you give me like what you think maybe two or three are the most advisable policies that existed, during the Cold War or now or whatever. What do you think that the two or three things that they're doing well right now, or in that relatively recent time frame? What are those policies?
So I think the biggest thing for me is this ruthlessly enforced, maybe not ruthlessly, maybe that's too harsh of a term, but this very rigorously enforced competitive market. And that screams subsidiarity in the most pragmatic sense to me, where the foundation of the German economy is built off what they call the Mittelstand, which is medium to small size business, usually owned by families, employing less than 500 people, making less than, I think, 5 million every fiscal year. The foundation of the German economy is that Mittelstand, and monopolies, corporate oligarchies are very quickly put down by the government in order to ensure this small business competitive environment. And I think when, say, you look at the writings of Chesterton or Belloc and their idea of spreading ownership as widely as possible, it's all very theoretical. There's not a lot of pragmatic, real suggestions, real policy we can build off of, and even if there is, it's a bit outdated. I think when you look at how Germany does it, it is the most up-to-date example we can look at of realistically spreading ownership as wide as possible through making medium, small-sized family businesses the staple of the economy, and using the state as a kind of pragmatic interventionist tool to make sure that they have an environment that's fair to them and not let these corporate oligarchies kind of build up and get this economic hegemony that we kind of see in America.
So maybe more briefly stated, you would just say kind of a robust enforcement of antitrust, kind of similar to the U.S. maybe from 1880 to 1920 or something like that.
Yeah, maybe like the Teddy Roosevelt, bull moose progressive era, but enshrined into kind of the economic framework, not just something that can pass from administration to administration. I mean, and you have to understand that system is supported by every other adjacent system that feeds into it. So the education system in Germany is another thing that I really like, where it's very complicated, but it consists of two parts primarily. Lower schooling and upper schooling. So lower schooling is what we would call primary schooling. It's just basic general education that you take until you're about anywhere from like 14 to 16. And then you go to upper schooling, which is either technical school, you go to technical or vocational school, or you attend higher education. And these technical and vocational schools then feed into the Mittelstand model, where you have this, relatively large population of very well-trained workers that can go work in these productive industries that the German economy is built to foster. And then you have, your higher education, your college-educated people going to work in, say, the management of these companies, or, to the, the larger corporations, your international kind of conglomerates, your Volkswagens, your BMWs, all that.
Right.
You then have, on the opposite side of that, the way they handle workers' rights, union protections, healthcare. Again, it's all very. If I could sum up the German economy, the system in one word, it's pragmatic. It just what works best, what ensures a sense of class collaboration rather than conflict, and what will make it so that we can continue to feed into this system so that it works optimally. Because that's.
So it's not. It seems like it sounds a lot like when people talk about German, the German engineering and all of this, right? And it's very. It's like who cares who cares about the theoretical physics? I just want to know how this thing works. And it seems like what you're getting across here is it's a similar kind of discussion about policy. It's like who cares about ideology? I don't care. I have this set of goals that I want to meet, and I think this is the best way for me to meet those goals. So that's what I'm going to do. Boom. Easy.
Yeah. The whole Freiburg School, which is how the school of thought that Germany rebuilt its economy after the post-war, was the whole idea of it is how do we use the state to maximize the theoretical output of the market, and that's the primary function of the state intervening in the economy, is to maximize the theoretical output of the market. So every time anything the state is doing to intervene in the economy is just to I don't want to say just to maximize efficiency, because that sounds a bit productivist, and that's not how I would classify it, but it's just the pragmatic use of the state as a tool to ensure the outcomes that the federal government wants.
They have other considerations, like they're concerned about harmony and stuff like this. They're not just concerned about make GDP go higher, kind of stonks.
There's a large focus on subsidiarity too, as I was alluding to earlier, in the sense that Germany is a federal republic, just like ours, the Bundesrepublik, and regional identity is a very big deal in Germany. German and you're Bavarian. It's a kind of split national, local, regional identity. So a lot of this is handled at as low a level as possible. So education, for example, what I gave you was a very kind of broad overview, but education is not the job of the federal government in Germany. It's the
Right.
job of the local regional government.
Mm.
Whatever the region decides is
So
best
kind of
for
like
its.
kind of like here in the U.S. I mean, in that
Yeah,
sense, in terms of who is governing it. Yeah.
they modeled the federalism, well, mostly off of Weimar, but a lot off of the U.S. system as well. But
Right.
that's the way that healthcare works too. It's generally it's a multi-payer system, but regions and employers actually have a lot of say over how it works,
Right.
as well as regional regulations and how things are to be governed, tax codes. So there's this large focus on making sure that each federal state has
Mm.
its independence economically protected from the federal government, where the federal government isn't going to get overly involved in it. So there's that strong focus on subsidiarity.
Right. Well, I mean, that does, when you put it that way, it does sound, kind of like what we really, I mean, just broadly what we're looking for. And I think, some people would argue that, the U.S., at least to some extent, has that same thing built into the Constitution with the 10th Amendment and with, this idea that, well, the Commerce Clause kind of just messed everything up. Like we used to have this kind of regionalist kind of thing, but I think this is a really good time to take a quick break and mention my sponsor for this episode, because we're talking about subsidiarity and local and I think specifically more about supporting Catholic businesses, which is something I talk about a lot on the show. So I want to mention Colette's Carvings, which is a business run by a good friend of mine. So they make these beautiful wooden plaques for your home, and so they're for all kinds of different, whether it's a gift, maybe you want a wall hanging for. I bought a wall hanging from them as a wedding gift for a friend of mine. They have saints, custom family, the Joneses established, 1995 or whatever, nursery signs. I have my son is named after St. Francis Xavier, and so we have a nursery sign that says St. Francis Xavier, pray for us on it. It's beautiful, and I'm hoping my son, he I guess recovers the Jesuits maybe one of these days.
Yeah,
But their motto is Devotionals and Decor from our home to yours. So check them out on Etsy at the link in the show notes. Okay, so I think, Francis, what we want to do, I guess, say St. Francis Xavier, and now I'm talking to Francis, right? That's great.
yeah. St. Francis of Assisi, more specifically
right,
on this side,
okay.
got to show loyalty
There you go.
to La Patria.
Oh my goodness.
All this talk about Northern Europe, it's going to make me sick at some point, but I can continue on.
I think I should just call you Francis from Philly or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so kind of understanding that Germany, at least at one time in the relatively recent past, had at least the intention of creating something that seemed to fit pretty well within Catholic bounds. And specifically, you mentioned the education system, which I think the kind of gut reaction from the U.S. on that would be, oh, well, that doesn't sound very individualistic, right? That doesn't sound like, oh, well, you're not letting little Susie, flourish as a whatever, making PowerPoints for some, megacorp, or,
Yeah.
I told Billy he could be the president one day. And, if they're going to force him into, this, this tech school because he has a, 106 IQ, then, he's not going to be president. And then, you spoke about the antitrust legislation, the antitrust enforcement that was very consistent and strong. And of course, in the U.S., we've seen a massive breakdown in the way antitrust is enforced. I think there are some really innovative, sharp minds on a lot of this stuff in the Chicago school right now, talking about the way some of these property rights need to work with respect to big tech and things like this. So some very interesting things out there that maybe I'll discuss on a future show. But how did they get to this point? What in the sort of peculiar history of Germany, what brought them to this point? Why, is there something specific about Germany that got us to, or that got them to the point where they're like, look, we're not worried about individualism. We're not worried about, we're not worried about, my GDP. We're going to support the medium and small businesses, and we're going to make sure that, even if Jimmy is, even if mommy thinks he could be the president, Jimmy just needs to go, bake some bread or something.
School. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I first start off by saying political Catholicism has been so ingrained into Catholic culture, going so far back, all the way back to the Holy Roman Empire and arguably even Charlemagne. It just the influence of the Catholic Church ethically and socially is just so inextricably linked to German state building throughout history, even during the kind of dominance of the Protestants during Bismarck's era. So even if Catholicism was never, for a time was not explicitly, the state religion, or even during a time during the Kulturkampf was repressed and fought against, there's just this lasting influence that's always been there. But more specifically, with a lot of things regarding the modern German state, the origins of this particular economic and social system go back to Bismarck. So in the 1880s, there was, this rising socialist current throughout Europe, as a reaction to the excesses of, the Industrial Revolution and, the capitalism of the time. And in an effort to kind of stem those currents and to pull support away from the socialist parties and especially the SPD in Germany, Bismarck instituted a set of policies that have, colloquially become as a group have been known as Staatssozialismus, or state socialism, which I don't think is a very good term. He termed it, I think he called it practical Christianity. It's got a lot of little terms assigned to it, but basically it was a set of legislation passed from the early to late 1880s regarding accident insurance, sickness insurance, old age and disability insurance, laws regarding safety regulation in factories, laws regarding wages, regarding the representation of unions, and antitrust, making sure that the Junker estates, which were these big kind of aristocratic corporations, didn't have this domineering power over the German state legislature and over the workers, purely out of the pragmatic reasoning of, we don't want the socialist tides to pick up too much steam. So that's where you find the start of all this, and that just kind of guided German legislation for most of the 20th century up until the 1930s, when there was that unfortunate period of time during the Second World War. You then see after the war a kind of return to this kind of what was then pragmatic statecraft, now under a more ideological grounding. So the first party that took power in Germany after the Nazis was the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, which was the kind of spiritual successor to the Zentrum or Center Party, which was a explicitly Catholic political party. And the first chancellor of Germany after that war period was Konrad Adenauer and his economic advisor Ludwig Erhard, and they were both strict adherents to Christian or Catholic. They were both Protestants, I think, so broadly Christian moral and ethical social teaching. And they tried their best to enshrine that in the state they wanted to build. They were the trailblazers. They got to craft this new German state into what they saw fit. So when they were building it, they explicitly went out to build it with these Christian principles of subsidiarity, solidarity, and to an extent corporatism. So you can trace these roots back to especially the strong influence that the Center Party, Zentrum, had in the German political sphere. For in its whole history, it was the second or third largest party in Germany, and the CDU today is still one of the two big parties in Germany, along with the SPD. So this lasting influence of, even if Germany isn't Catholic anymore, or even largely Christian, this lasting influence of Christian ethics in the economy has really burrowed itself into the very foundation of the German political economy.
Yeah, and that's interesting, that last bit that you say, because last week on my show, I was talking about Hayek, and in response to the Road to Serfdom, it's kind of a cheesy title, but I called it Hayek's Road Rage, and it seems to fit what you're saying, seems to fit with this idea that a lot of the things that we like about the way things still kind of work now. I mean, even as bad as things are because of the way the left has really infiltrated so many different things policy wise. What is these pre-liberal institutions like the importance of the family, the primacy of the family, this focus on community as some kind of authentic, experience that we have. This part of our lives that isn't our choice, right? It seems like you're saying that it's kind of a similar sort of story here with Germany, where the reason why they have some of these good things is because they're still drawing on maybe sort of subconsciously or unconsciously drawing on these sort of Christian pre-liberal types of perspectives on these things.
Yeah, that's actually absolutely right. I'm glad you brought up that point. If I can go back to referencing the Center Party's interim, during during the Weimar period, one of their tagline slogans, whatever you want to call it, was "Wer Schutz Family Heimat Arbeit das Zentrum," which means roughly who protects the family, the locality. Heimat doesn't really have a direct translation, but it means the region or the state. Who protects the family, the region, and the worker, the center. So these, even in the 30s, I arguably, deeply into the liberal era, we still have the Catholic Christian Party standing up for these Christian ethical positions of enshrining the importance of the family, of the local, community, and of course the dignity of the worker and work itself.
So I mean, to me, this is a very interesting kind of historical perspective on some of the things that, again, at least allegedly, right? I mean, we're not gonna legislate or try to argue whether or not these things explicitly fit in some kind of Catholic model today. But I think you certainly could make an argument, especially on subsidiarity type grounds. So one of the last things I want to ask you about before we go is this idea of this idea that you like corporatism, but yet at the same time, we're interested in subsidiarity, and we're interested in making the medium to small size businesses the primary, the primary business in the country. So how do those two things fit together? I mean, when I hear corporatism, I think, okay, well, we've got the boards of these industries, right? They or these large companies, right? They come up with some representatives, and those representatives explicitly go and sit on boards that communicate directly with the government and sort of make suggestions about policy and stuff like this. I mean, if I'm this mom and pop shop, how am I supposed to feel comfortable that my interests are going to be met when it seems like these very large businesses have this direct line to the government? Not that I'm saying it's any different now in the U.S. I mean, come on, but why is that? Why do those two things fit together?
Well, firstly, I'd make the distinction in the corporatist model that corporate or corporation doesn't mean corporation in the business or American sense. A corporation in the corporatist sense means an interest group, a collection of businesses or actors joining together to, maybe they're in a related field or industry, getting a seat at the table in the government. So you would have a quote unquote corporation for, say, auto manufacturers, but then on the flip side of that, you would have a corporation for auto workers, right? So there's always equal representation on both sides, and then the government acts as an intermediary to help everyone come up with a policy that's generally agreeable regarding wages, production levels, prices. It's all about ensuring that class collaboration, not conflict. And what I'd say is
just to stop you real quick, I think what's so interesting about that is that one of the big complaints a lot of people have about the way our system works now is that there's if you have the money, you can buy access, right?
Right.
And so what you're saying is now by creating these boards and this more political kind of system for getting representation from everybody, then you kind of just take the money out of it and you just say, well, everybody's going to have a seat at the table, and okay, there's politics in, which which industry is represented in which way, and who gets to come in and be the actual voice in the room for that specific industry. But at least it's not, whoever has the lowest fixed cost per unit, right?
Right. And it's also important to think of it in our system now when a union and a business go together to negotiate, it's a combative thing. They're fighting with each other and they're both trying to get the one up. One's trying to pull the rug over the other, trying to get the better deal. And it has nothing to do with the good of the nation, the good of the people, the good of the state. When you have the corporatist system, you have the state acting as on whatever level, be it the federal government, the local government, regional, however, according to subsidiarity, whatever it is, you have them working together not in a combative way, but as I said, a collaborative way, working together to say, okay, what's best for what's agreeable to both of us, but what is ultimately best for society at large, for our community, for our nation. So I think that's another important distinction between the way we do things now and the way they could be. But to your other point about what do we want? Do we want the German model, or the kind of more distributist subsidiarity one, or do we want the corporatist model where things are a bit more centralized? And my answer to that might not be satisfying, but I think it's a case-by-case scenario. So in Germany, going back to how I was talking about the importance of the region, of the state, that is something intrinsic to the German character. Regionalism is a very important, aspect of German identity, of everyday life. So a model of this, this German model, this more distributist, subsidiarity-based model works for them. Versus, say, in Portugal or Austria, this smaller nations where the region doesn't mean as much, it's more acceptable for the government to take a larger leading role in helping the unions, the business, the different aspects, the different corporate, organic units of society come together and put together a plan to move the country forward. So I think in the American context, the German model would work better because federalism is deeply ingrained into our national character. States' rights are very important. I would argue. I mean, I think the states should have, a reasonable amount of power. So I'm sure you would agree. But
yeah, and
and then,
this is just the fundamentals of subsidiarity. And I think what sometimes gets missed is the practical part of it, right? The practical part of it is, well, okay, if we're going to ensure that the lower levels of society have more control over the things that they're competent to do, whereas the top level is only dealing with things that really nobody else can handle, right? That's appropriate to them. Well, somebody has to set that up, and of course, the people at the top are going to have to be the ones that set it up, and so we get this idea that it's, oh, the federalist system works great, and it's like, well, really, I think that the problem is that they didn't have, the federal level wasn't strong enough to ensure subsidiarity would continue to exist. I mean, here in the U.S. context, right? And so what you actually needed, sort of, maybe it's not intuitive, but what we actually needed was the federal level to have more control over who was going to deal with which sphere of economic or social policy. And that's how we got to the point where we're at, where the federal government is supposed to handle everything.
Right. I mean, to sum it up, I think what you're saying is there was a little too much gray area left. There weren't enough clear duties defined for the state versus the federal government.
Yeah.
There was a lot left undefined.
They complain about the Commerce Clause, but it's like, well, the Commerce Clause was ripe for the picking, right?
Yeah, exactly. You leave these back doors in, and then you get what we have, which is unfortunate.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate your time, Francis, and thanks for joining me. Thanks for kind of, informing me about all of this history of Germany and understanding kind of how things can go right. I mean, I think this is an important thing. Hayek said that, as much as I disagree with Hayek now, but I think he, at one point when he was talking about macro theory, he said, we have to, in order to understand how things can go wrong, we have to understand how they can go right. And I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think there needs to be more of this kind of positive discussion. In other words, what do we want? Not critical always, right? Well, not what we don't want, but what we want, right? And what can go well, what can go right, what can improve. And I think it's quite obvious that if we have this idea that we're going to lean on the Catholic social teaching of the church with subsidiarity, solidarity, the universal destination of goods, and like you say, maybe in a practical sense, right? This idea of a corporatist model for the the setup of the government itself. It seems like we couldn't do a whole lot better than studying Germany and some of these other countries around that time. So I appreciate your time, Francis, and I thank everybody for listening. I really appreciate everybody checking out the show and listening. I think there's a lot of great stuff out there, and I try to do as many interviews as I can possibly get, because I think there's so much knowledge locked up in these Zoomer kids and other millennials like myself that they don't have this fancy degree, this terminal degree, but they've just, for some reason, they spent 80 hours a week from age 12 to 16 reading about nothing but the Cold War Germany and stuff like that. And so we got to unlock this. It's great stuff.
When you spend autistic amounts of time reading about obscure Catholic political parties in Weimar Germany, you come out with little trinkets of knowledge, these little golden nuggets.
Of course,
that you can share with everybody.
Francis is not mocking autistic people there. It's
obviously
internet
not.
speak.
It's internet speak, obviously. Yeah. It's a joke.
All right. Well, hey, thanks again.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, man. Well, thanks. As you know, we could use more voices on the Traditionalist Right, and one of the best ways to do that is with a podcast. I've been using Anchor.fm for this podcast and for another podcast for over a year, and I've really enjoyed it. It's free, and it allows me to upload clips and also to record and edit. It also disperses all of my podcasts to all the major platforms, including Apple Podcast and Spotify. It also allows me to monetize and to collect donations. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. If you want to join me in being a voice for the Traditionalist Right, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.